My name's Rich Conroy. I'm the Director of Education at Bike New York. I have worked as a salesperson and a mechanic in a bike shop. I'm a veteran of many personal flat tires that I have fixed. And I taught a recycle a bicycle program to middle school kids for 2 years, where we taught how to fix flat tires. A little bit about Bike New York. We are a local New York City-based nonprofit organization whose mission is to promote cycling and empower people to get out there and enjoy their biking. And that includes fixing some unpleasant and unexpected things that happen on their own, like flat tires. Our education program in the past 3-4 years has really grown. It was already pretty big, but we've reached between 24 and 30,000 people a year for the past 4 years. And that includes last year with videos and an online bicycle education resource hub, as well as Zoom classes like this. We are kind of hurting a little bit financially because of COVID. Our major fundraising events were all canceled last year, and they are kind of looking uncertain for this year. So if you do learn anything from this class and enjoy it, please do hit the donate button on our web page, homepage, which is bike.nyc. So as I said, our mission is to empower people to get out there and ride and enjoy biking. And one of the greatest things I think about biking is that you can do it with your friends, you can do it with your community, so it can be a social thing, but it can also be something that makes you more independent, like independent financially, independent of using cars, using gasoline, independent of maybe the subway and bus schedule. But it does take some know-how. And one of the reasons why we like to teach the Fix a Flat class and bike maintenance classes is that it makes people more independent. So if you ride a bike with any kind of frequency, you are going to get a flat tire. It's just going to happen, even under the best of circumstances. And so being prepared and knowing how to do that, rather than having to take a cab home from a bike ride or run over to the bike shop and pay them $25 to do that. Or if you are on a ride, having somebody do it for you, you know how to do it yourself, which is great. Now, normally we would love to teach this in person as a hands-on class. And there's lots of video tutorials out there on how to do this. In fact, after this class in the next couple of days, we'll share with you a pretty slow-paced video tutorial from our own former bike fleet manager, Jared Lauritsen, whose job it was to fix all of our own flat tires. So what we're going to cover this evening is how to prevent flats, tools that you will need, stuff that you're going to need, and then we will go through a step-by-step instructional on how to fix a flat tire. So let's talk first about preventing flats. This will help you a lot and will really cut down on the number of flat tires that you get. So there's kind of 3 key rules here. First, whatever tires you have on your bike, keep them inflated to within their rated pressure range, which you can find on somewhere on the side of the tire. Now, some bikes come with kind of cheap tires that aren't real flat resistant, like your department store bikes. And so when those tires wear out, or if you find yourself getting a lot of flat tires, you might invest in some flat resistant tires out there. Every single brand of bike tire manufacturer makes a flat resistant tire. They do add a little bit of weight, but it's usually kind of a Kevlar or an aramid or some kind of other puncture resistant lining inside the tire that really stops stuff from coming through. I myself, for my road bikes and touring bikes, really like the Continental gator skins. And there's even a tougher version of that called the Continental Gator Skin Hard Shell. I've not used that one because when I get into things like hard shells and flak jackets, they tend to ride like a concrete wheel, which you might pick up from tires that have more flat resistant. But I'm willing to pay for that. A little tougher riding. Maybe I'd let a little bit of air out of the tires so that they ride a little more smoothly in exchange for not having to fix flats constantly. And then finally, if you are getting flat tires frequently, you might want to just look at your tires. Is the tread worn out? Is the center smooth and you can see what's left of the tread on kind of the sides? Are the sidewalls getting like cracked and dried out so you can kind of start to see the casing that's inside the rubber? Is there a big cut? Are there some holes that are starting to look kind of big, holes and cracks? Those things are going to cause flat tires. So if you see that kind of stuff, it's time to get new tires. One thing about keeping your tires inflated within the pressure range, the first point here, if you ride your tires soft, like below the rated pressure range, you can get a flat tire without even running over anything that's sharp. If you hit kind of a hard edge, like the steel plates that are on New York City streets, or the hard edge of a pothole, or maybe the lip of a driveway, a major crack that's in the bike path or in the street as you cross it, what happens is your tube that holds the air inside the tire, it's a separate part, gets compressed between the tire and the rim, and it causes two little holes. So that's why you want to keep the tires inflated. Tires might lose about half their air within 1 week. They do deflate naturally. If you lose a lot of air overnight, you've got a slow leak. If you lose maybe half your air and it gets soft over the space of a week, maybe the tube's just kind of cheap or something, but you should check your tubes, your air pressure, at least once a week. If you don't ride that much, check your inflation every time you go out and ride. Okay, so here's some equipment and items you're going to need. So make sure if you're doing this on the road that you have a spare tube with you. And if you're doing this at home, you get it like, oh, my bike tire's flat. You can go to a bike shop or a Target or whatever and probably buy a spare tube. But if you're out on the road and you want to do this, you got to take your tube with you. So a couple things to know. First, there are two basic valve types. One is Presta, and the other is Schrader. So the Schrader is the same type of valve as like a car valve. And a Presta is kind of a brass or a metal valve. And the drilling inside the rim is a different diameter. So you can fit a Presta valve tube, which is narrower, the valve is narrower, into the hole for a Schrader valve. But you can't do it the other way around. Like the Schrader valve's too fat to fit in the skinny hole for the Presta valve. Second thing you need to know is what is the size of the tube or the tire that you have. Now your tire is going to give an exact size for that tire. It might say, it'll look like a math equation. You can find the size written somewhere on the side, and it's always going to look like some sort of a multiplication problem. The first number is the diameter of your rim. And the second number is the width crossways from left to right of the tire, how fat or skinny it is. Now, things can be a little bit tricky here because there are a couple of different sizes, 2 or 3 different sizes of 26. The 700, which looks exactly like 27, which is an older, obsolete size, are actually 2 different sizes that, at least in terms of tire, is not interchangeable. 700 is also the same rim diameter as the 29er mountain bike size. There are 2 different sizes of 20. Now, some of this may not matter when you're buying a tube because tubes are flexible. I walked into a shop with my fat bike and I was having a lot of problems with flats, and I was out of patches or something. And my fat bike is a big 26 fat tube, and the shop was out of 26 fat tubes, and they put, what was it, a 650B or 27.5 semi-fat tube. It was a totally different size, but because it's such a big tire and it, you know, the tube is flexible, they were able to get away with that, and it worked just fine. But you're not going to be able to put a 26-inch tube into a 700C tire and make it work. Probably you're not going to put the fat size of a 20-inch tire into the skinny version, which is a different rim diameter. So if you have questions about this, take your tube or your tire into a bike shop or write down the size that you see on the tire and go into the bike shop, and they'll get you the right thing. If you're buying it on your own off the internet or at Target, you want to make sure that this first number is the same. The second number has to be in the ballpark. So for example, if I have a road racing bike, that's going to generally be a 700. But then a road racing bike, this number is going to be smaller than 32. It will be 25, 23, 20, 19. Anything from 25 to 19, in fact, you might even see this number, 25 to 19 is the second number, will work. 32 is kind of getting a lot wider. So I could use probably a 28, a 30, a 32, a 35, something that's relatively close to this number. This second number is what I'm saying is doesn't have to be exact, but it has to kind of be close. I'm not going to stuff a 32 millimeter tube into a 19 millimeter tire. It's just not going to fit. So question here, somebody's asking, what should e-bike owners be aware of? Differences from a conventional bike. So the e-bike wheel sizes are the same as a mountain bike. I'm sorry, as regular bikes. So these numbers here, depending on the model of bike you have, will be the same, and they mean the same things. I should mention these numbers correspond to an ERD, effective rim diameter. And for different sizes of wheels, they each have their own ERD, which is why a 29er mountain bike has the same ERD as a skinny tired road bike, even though those 2 tires probably won't match each other on the same rims. It's when you maybe get into changing the tire, replacing the tire on an e-bike, that you might want to check the shop or the company that sold that e-bike to you if there's a special, more robust tire. Certain kinds of components on an e-bike are made more robustly, stronger because of the motor and battery forces involved. Otherwise, things should just fit just fine. The tubes a regular bike tire would work for a while. It may be shorter lived, at least on the back wheel of an e-bike. All right, let's move on. Now, if you want to fix flats that happen on the road, on a trip, I would recommend getting what's called a frame pump. And they're light little portable pumps that attach somewhere on the frame. I would not use a frame pump for routine, at home, check and reinflate your tires. If you want to do that, I would recommend getting a floor pump, which is more robust, heavier duty, oftentimes come with a gauge. There are a few of these out there made by Toe Peak and I think Leazine, Crank Brothers, that come with built-in gauges that are reasonably accurate. But for routine home inflation, you want a floor pump. For fixing problems that happen on the road, you need a frame pump. I myself, when I'm buying a frame pump, prefer models that come with a built-in hose. So Leazine and Toe Peak are two companies that sell pumps like that. The reason why I like a built-in hose, and the hose on this one's hidden inside the pump, and you have to take it out and attach it to the pump body, is that I'm always worried that with the jerking back and forth with a little frame pump, I'm going to break the valve or cause some valve damage where it attaches to the tube. With a hose, you don't have to do that. And I also feel like it's just easier to handle. You're not jerking the whole thing back and forth against the wheel and the valve stem. Again, if you are repairing flat tires on the road, you're going to need a few things. So besides your spare tube, you're going to need anywhere, I would say 2 or 3 tire levers. You can get away with 1, but if your tire is really tight, and we'll talk about that later, 2 or 3 will get you out of that bind. You're gonna need a spare tube, of course. And then I take along a patch kit, and usually my tire levers will fit inside that patch kit. And that patch kit's good for if you have a bad day, if you have more than 1 flat tire. So when I pull my punctured tube out, if I'm on a trip, I'm not at home, I try to find where that leak is at. And while I'm replacing the tube, patch the one that's bad so that I know that I've at least got a 50-50 or better chance of having a replacement tube in case I get another flat tire. When I said flat tires are going to happen, sometimes they happen in droves. I can go months without a flat tire. But I was on a trip, a bike tour with my girlfriend. It was our first long bike tour together, and we were going from Washington, D.C. to, Pittsburgh to Washington, D.C., and we were along the C&O Canal Trail in Maryland. And I had something like a dozen flat tires over the course of 3 days. I ran out of tubes. I ran out of patches. My pump wore out. And I finally had to walk like 3 miles to the nearest town with a fully loaded touring bike and a flat tire to a bike shop where I could get a replacement tire and some spare tubes and a patch kit. That's kind of like a worst case scenario. If you have a bad day, you're usually going to have 1 puncture and then maybe a second. The other thing I carry with me, and it's tiny, is what's called a Presta valve adapter. So if you have Presta valves, the skinny valves, this turns your Presta valve into the wider type of valve called the Schrader, which is helpful if you're using a gas station air hose or something, which only work with the fat Schrader valves. So that's pretty tiny. And then I carry a multi-tool, which does absolutely nothing to repair a flat tire. But if you have something loose or you need to adjust your seat, that's where your multi-tool helps you out. And I keep all of this stuff in a nice little seat wedge bag. You want to get a big enough bag that will hold these items, depending on how big they are. If you have a mountain bike, a fat bike, an adventure bike, you're probably going to need a bigger bag for a larger tube. Now, there's some types of bikes out there that don't have quick release hubs. If you have a single speed, if you have a fixed gear, if you have a bike with an internally geared hub on the back, you are probably going to need a wrench to remove the wheel. And you might need a screwdriver to disconnect the cables that attach your brakes or your gear changing cable to the hub. So make sure you know the equipment that you have, because what I'm going to show you in the pictures in the rest of the slide deck is pretty basic, standard issue, quick release rear wheel with a derailleur. By the way, you can buy a little like 6-inch adjustable wrench. Those fit in the seat bags pretty well. Otherwise, you can buy, most wheels use a 15 millimeter wrench. Some use a 17. If you have a very, very old bike, it might be an odd size. So make sure you either use an adjustable wrench or you know what size of bolt you need. A lot of kids' bikes will require a 15 millimeter wrench. Okay, so what you don't want to use is anything that's kind of like a pliers, a gripping tool. You want a wrench, if you have a bolt-on hub, that precisely fits the nuts that hold that axle on. These things tear up those axle nuts, and then it makes your life actually harder. And unless you're like eating a peanut butter and jelly sandwich or bagels with lox, you do not need a butter knife to remove your tires. That will just puncture your tires. Don't use a screwdriver to remove your tires. You really have to use tire levers. All right, let's get into how to do this. So of course, the first thing you need to change a flat tire is to actually have a flat tire, or to know that, hey, my tires are getting old and I need to replace them and I want to do it myself. So if you have a standard, and I'm going to talk about the rear wheel because the majority of flats happen on the rear wheel, partly because that wheel does more work, it carries more weight, it wears out faster than the front wheel. So this is kind of a standard rear wheel setup. You have a cluster of gears here in the back, you have a derailleur, you have a quick release lever, or maybe a bolt-on hub. So the first thing you do if your flat tire is on the back is shift the chain to the smallest cog. If you have an internally geared hub, make sure you know the directions for either what gear to shift in. You may not need to shift into any particular gear at all. And then, how to release the cable from that internally geared hub, which we're not going to go through tonight because there's just too many different possible combinations. But your life is going to be very easy to remove the rear wheel and to put it back on if you have that chain on the smallest cog. Now, if you have rim brakes, which are still very popular on bikes, you're going to probably need to release the rim brakes. On most road bikes, that release is on the brake itself. If your road bike has Campagnolo shifting levers, the release is a little button that's on most Campy shifting levers. The other big popular type of rim brake are V-brakes, and your cable release is right here where you have to kind of squeeze these two arms together And then there's a little slot in this swing arm that allows you to guide the cable, not this big noodle here, but guide the cable out of that slot, and then it allows the brake arms to spring apart. And you know, bikes with these V brakes or cantilever brakes, which are kind of similar, tend to have wider, fatter tires, and it's just hard to, even with a flat tire, to squeeze the tire between the brake pads because the tire is just way too wide. So you have to release them. Now, if you have a quick release on the back wheel or whatever wheel you're working on, you want to open that quick release. And most releases say closed on one side and open on the other, and it should feel fairly tight. So you just swing it open. Now on the back wheel, normally if opening the quick release enables you to just pull the wheel out. If it's the front wheel, you're going to have to unscrew the nut on the other side, maybe 2, 3, 4 turns. You don't need to take the entire assembly of the quick release off, and please don't, because there are like 2 little springs that if they fall off the quick release, you have to remember which way they go back on. Otherwise the wheel doesn't kind of go back straight in the frame or the fork. So just unscrew that nut a little bit. You don't need to take it completely off. Let me go back to that previous slide. If you have a bolt-on hub and you're using a wrench, you want to turn counterclockwise to loosen those axle nuts. And again, you should not need to completely remove them. Sometimes there's washers in there, spacers, safety washers. You don't want that stuff falling off into the grass or wherever you're fixing your flat tire. So you don't really need to remove any parts from the wheel to get it released from the bike. If you are working on a back wheel, to get the wheel out, you probably need to maybe pick the bike up. Some people put their bikes upside down. If you want to do it that way, you can. Just make sure you take your computer or bell off or reposition it so it's not getting all scratched up or damaged. But usually the wheel will just drop out. You might have to grab the back part of the derailleur. There's a little tab right here. It's not the dirtiest part of the derailleur. And stretch the derailleur out a little bit, push this part, swing it down like that. And that helps clear the chain a little bit from the derailleur. You may need to give the wheel a pop, you know, a little bang with your hand just to pop it out of the frame if it's kind of stuck in there. Usually they come out pretty easily. Okay, so now you have the wheel out and you're ready to remove the tube or remove part of the tire from the wheel. And that's what we're going to show you here. So if you are just replacing tires, you don't actually have a flat, you're going to need to let the air out of the tire. But if you have a flat or the air's already out, you're going to need to start working with your tire levers here. And the way you do this, hold on, there we go, is you want to start with your tire lever on the opposite side of the wheel from the valve stem. The valve stem kind of creates its own little problem if you try to start removing the tire right here. So your life's going to be easier if you start opposite from the valve stem, even if it's at like 10 o'clock, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, somewhere in here, not close to the valve. So the tire lever itself, you want to position that correctly. And the tire lever has 2 ends to it that are different. One end looks like a hook, and we'll explain what that is for in a minute. The other end looks like a little spoon or a spade or a little miniature pry bar. And that's the end you want to use to get the tire pried over the edge of the rim. So what I do is I pull the tire back and I expose this part. You'll see there's a kind of a lip here on the tire, and that's called the bead. And what's inside the bead is either a steel cable, or on lighter, higher quality tires, it's made of Kevlar. And that bead is what holds your tire to the rim when you start putting air in it. That's also what makes it really hard to get off the tire, off the rim. So what I do is I pull it back and I put my little end, the little pry bar end underneath the bead. And you can see I have my tire lever almost vertical here, as I do in this picture. Okay, so you want it vertical. And I try prying the tire over the edge of the rim. And you'll at least be able to get 1 or 2 inches of tire pried over the edge of the rim. Now, depending on your tire and rim combination, this is where you can have some difficulties. A lot of tires are just easy to peel right off. If you've pried it over and now your tire lever is pointing towards the inside of the rim, what I do is I grab the lever, and you can see I'm grabbing it with my fist. Okay, we're not holding a pencil here or a needle and thread. You do have to use some strength, and I'm pulling that lever towards me. And as you can see, I'm bracing the tire against my body and against my nice expensive Bike New York t-shirt. And but in case you do have to use a fair amount of force or pressure, this helps keep the wheel in place as you're trying to peel that tire off. Most tires will come off pretty easily, and you can just peel it one side of the tire all the way around the rim. Now, if you're lucky enough to have a model of tire that's tighter on that rim and tougher, and it just won't move, the tire lever won't move and peel off the tire, this is why you need a second lever. And this is what that hook is for. So I've pried one section of tire, maybe this much off, an inch or two, but I can't move the lever because it's just, the tire's way too tight. I hook the lever on the spoke. I go back to this step, maybe a couple of inches away from that first lever. I pull the tire back again. I put my second tire lever under there, under the bead. I pry it over again. Now I've exposed maybe 4 inches or 6 inches. With really tight levers, you may need to use 3 levers. You may need to hook that second lever on another spoke and go back with a third lever to this step. By the time you get a third lever, though, you've gotten maybe 8, 9 inches of tire off, and the tire is saying, all right, I'm a tough guy, but I'm giving up here. I'm now have a lot of tension released. And then you'll be able to go back to this step with that second or third lever and peel it off all the way around. Okay, if you are just replacing a tube, you can leave the other side of the tire installed on the rim. There's no reason to take the tire off. If you are replacing the tire, like they're old and worn out, then of course take the tire off. But there's no reason to take the tire off if you're just replacing a punctured tube. So I pull the tube out. You can reach in there in the exposed side of the tire that you pried off. And you pull the tube out. And again, you want to start on the opposite side of the valve and take the valve out last. So you can see here, I'm taking the valve out last. You might have to pull the tire back a little bit so you can get at the section of tube where the valve is and just pull it out of the hole. By the way, if you have a Presta valve, there's a little nut, or there may be a little nut on the outside of the rim holding that Presta valve on right here, and you'll be able to see it. And it should be finger loose, especially if the tire's flat. You want to unscrew that nut and take it off because it's holding the valve to the rim. Okay, so what I do is as I'm taking the tube out, I keep track of the orientation of the tube. Which side is left of the valve? Which side is right of the valve as I take it out? And I lay the tube down on top of the tire in the same direction that I took it out. You don't want to flip it over or anything like that. And this is where I take my pump. Let's see if I have a picture here. No, I don't. I pump up the tire and I check for leaks. If I could hear an audible leak, or if I hold it up to my face, you can oftentimes feel the air coming out if you can't hear it audibly. If you can't get the tire to inflate at all, you probably have a pretty good sized puncture, and you might have to visually inspect the tube. Some fairly large holes, especially blowouts, can't be repaired with a patch, but little punctures can. But one of the reasons why I want to kind of find where the leak is so I can check, especially close on that part of the tire, to see if there's anything embedded in it. So whether or not I find the leak in the tube, I closely inspect the tire. And the way I do that is I visually inspect the outside. If there's anything embedded in the tire, I dig it out with a little screwdriver, maybe a little pocket knife. I may flex the hole that it's in so it just kind of falls out. Little bits of gravel get in there, pieces of sharp glass, anything that you see you want to remove. At the same time, I'm gently rubbing my fingertips inside the tire in case there is anything sticking through. You don't want to put a lot of pressure on, because if you do have a piece of sharp wire, small tack, a piece of sharp glass or something, you don't want to cut your fingers. I usually, as a reference point, maybe start at the decal or start at the valve stem and go all the way around, looking, removing stuff, and feeling the inside of the tire. If your tire's getting old, or it has maybe some sand and gravel from some mountain bike riding or whatever, you want to make sure you empty that stuff out of there, because it's abrasive and it will cause your tire to get an abrasion puncture sooner or later. There's another part you want to check that's not the tire. It's called the rim strip. It runs around the inside of the rim and protects the tube from the spokes or the spoke holes. And you want to make sure that's not damaged, no, it's not twisted, and that there aren't any spoke holes or pieces of the spoke nipple, the end of the spoke, exposed, that they could rub a hole in the tube. So just check that also. The biggest mistake people make is they get that damaged, punctured tube out. They have a good tube in their tool bag. They pump it up, they put it back in, they get everything reassembled, they go ride, and 5 minutes later they have another flat tire because they didn't find the source of the puncture. So make sure you check. All right, so here's some kind of different types of flat tires that you're going to find. The small pinhole is the most common, and that is something sharp went through the tire and punctured the tube, usually something small. The other kind of puncture you're going to find, and you won't find it in the tire, but you'll find it in the tube, and the evidence of it is two holes that are close together. And that is what's called a snake bite or a pinch flat, and that's caused by riding your tires too soft, too spongy, and you hit something hard like a curb edge, a driveway edge, a pothole, and your tire compressed the tube against the rim and caused two punctures right there. Another kind of flat tire is, and you'll see it, you won't be able to put in any air. With these two types of punctures, you should be able to get some air into the tube, although it won't hold the air. With these, you won't even get your tube to hold its shape with a big blowout. So that can be caused by a tire that's old and aged. Maybe it's been, the sidewalls are just so old and dried out, it's like dried out fabric and they aren't able to hold that air pressure anymore. Or a tire that's been overinflated and the casing is buckled, and all of a sudden maybe the tire gets a big bubble in it where it's got a weak spot. Sometimes that bead, the part that holds the tire to the rim, gets old and dried out, and all of a sudden you have a separation of 1 or 2 inches of the bead in the tire. And it's hard to see where that separation is, but believe me, when you get 60, 100 pounds of pressure inside that tire, it's looking for a way to get out. And any weakness in the tire or separation between the tire and the bead, that air pressure finds it and it comes out with a bang. Literally so loud it sounds like a gunshot. We'll talk about how to fix tires that have this kind of damage next week, and I would recommend signing up for our emergency repairs class, how to fix things that are just really catastrophically damaged. But I can tell you, if you have a huge hole caused by a blowout, you're going to need a new tube. You're not going to be able to patch and repair that, not without some kind of mechanical miracle. And then finally, a lot of times the connection between the valve stem and the tube itself just kind of wears out. Maybe gets a little hole in it. Maybe you were riding the tire kind of soft and that valve stem was flexing back and forth and rubbing against the rim, and it finally rubbed a hole in it. If you do have a puncture or a hole at the valve stem, that's not really patchable. It's new tube time for that. Okay, so you've checked your tube, your dead tube. You've found the source of the puncture. You've checked your tire, and assuming the tire is still in reasonably good shape to hold a tube. And believe me, a little puncture caused by a nail, a tack, a piece of wire, a piece of glass is not going to damage the tire enough that it won't hold the tube inside. Unless you run across something really big and sharp, like a piece of sharp steel in the road or something, that really cut a big hole in your tire. Most of the time, your tire is just fine from those small punctures. So you've checked everything, you removed any debris from the tire, you made sure the tire is in good air-holdable condition, and it's time to put that new tube in, the replacement tube. So what you want to do is inflate that tube just so it's holding its shape. You don't want to blow it up like a balloon. And if it's a mountain bike tube, you're going to have to put more pumps of air into it. A road bike tube doesn't take that much. But just get it to the point where it's not flattened out, it's holding its shape. And then putting that tube back in is the opposite sequence of events from taking it out. So you start with the valve stem, put that in, pull your tire back, stick the valve stem down into the valve hole. And then I usually cover that part of the tube with the tire right there. And then working away from the valve, you want to work in both directions, stuffing the tube inside the tire. And you'll figure out pretty quickly if you got too much air in there, because as you get close to the opposite side of the valve, you're not going to be able to fit it in there. You'll have a way too much tube and not enough tire. What you do is just let some air out. You may have to like start over again, stuffing the tube back in. If you have a Presta valve at this point, I install that Presta valve nut, if there is one, most of the way out. I don't get it super tight just yet. And once I've stuffed the tube back inside the tire, you want to slide the tire over so that the tube is resting over the rim. And the only part that's going to be exposed still is the outside edge of the tire that you removed in the first place. What you don't want to see is any bits of exposed tube sitting between the tire and the edge of the rim. That's going to be trouble. And I just want to remind people, because I've seen it happen at Fix-A-Flat classes, the side you pulled the tube out of, the old dead tube, is the side that you put a new tube in. This other side of the tire over here is still installed on the rim. There is no way you're going to get a tube to go inside in that side underneath the tire that's still installed. Go on the side that's exposed that you took off. Okay, so we've got the tube installed inside the tire and over the rim. And the only thing left to do in terms of installation is put the tire back on the rim. So you want to start at the valve stem. If you start on the other side and you end up at the valve stem is going to make your life difficult trying to get this last little bit of bead situated inside the rim. So you start at the valve. Usually I push the valve up in a little bit. You can see there's not much valve exposed here. And I use my thumbs and I push the edge of the tire over the rim so that the bead, this part here, is resting inside the rim. At this point, it's going to be pretty easy. The tire is going to be pretty slack and loose. Then I'm going to work in both directions away from the rim, doing the same thing, pushing the edge of the tire, the bead, over the rim so that it's inside the tire. And I'm going to work my way around to the opposite side from the valve. And that's where I'm going to end up with maybe 8 to 10 inches of tire that's still not pushed over the edge of the rim. Now, with a lot of tires, getting this last bit pushed over will be pretty easy. You are going to need to use some hand and thumb strength, even with easy tires. With very tight tires, though, that's where it gets tricky. If you can, it's really better. It prevents tube punctures to try to do this with your hands. So start doing your thumb exercises. Get one of those grip things because you might need strong hands. So what I do is I pull back on the tire while pushing the edge of the tire over the rim all the way around, and it'll just kind of pop back into place. Somebody needs to clean their wheel. You're getting awfully dirty hands here from this, which is probably going to happen, especially with your back wheel. Okay, now if you have a tire that's really tight, here's what you want to do. Let's talk about what you don't want to do. You don't want to push the tire lever up inside here and use it as a pry bar to pry the tire over. You have another set of tricks you can use first that won't puncture the tube. If you try to do this, it is possible to puncture the tube. just because the lever catches the tube and pinches it against that hard surface of the rim inside there. And you go to pump it up and right away it's leaking. So what you want to do is you want to find the part of the tire that's already on the rim and go maybe an inch or two behind that crossover point. This is the crossover point right here. And you're going to insert the lever in between the tire and the rim. And you can see I'm kind of pulling back on the tire, so I have a little space in there. And you'll notice the prying part of my lever is facing outwards, not inwards. There's a more close-up picture of it. This is the crossover spot. This is where the tire isn't installed, and this is where it is. So you're working in the part that's already installed. Then what you do, and again, I'm holding the wheel against my body, is, and the tire lever's kind of pointed up. It's more or less straight up and down. And I'm grabbing that lever with my fist because you are going to have to use, you know, some hand strength. Again, this requires strength, and you can't hold it like a pencil or a needle and thread or a teaspoon. So what I'm doing is I'm pulling back on the tire while I'm pulling that lever towards me as it's inside the rim. And what it does is it peels the tire, this part of the tire here, over the rim. So I'm pulling back, I'm pulling towards me, pulling back on the tire, pulling the lever towards me. It usually takes 2 or 3 of those motions to get the tire to pop into place. A lot of times it's not going to be that hard, but I have worked with some really tight tires. You're going to probably find that more in the road racing bike category than other types of tires. I've also found that some of the new tubeless compatible rims can be kind of difficult in terms of getting tires on. I haven't really talked about tubeless systems today because they're a totally different setup. They still use a tire and a wheel, but the insides are very different. Okay, so that is usually 95% of the time will be successful with a tight tire. Okay, let's go back. Now, what happens if this method that I just showed you doesn't work? What if you have that 5% of really super duper tight tires? We'll talk about a method that I don't recommend, but if you do it, this is the way to do it. Let's see if I can find the best slide. So you have several inches of tire that's over the rim. And doing the method that I just showed you does not work. It's too tight. Pulling the lever towards you is not peeling the tire on. There is a way to push the tire over using your lever, but you have to be very careful. What you want to do is you're going to have a left side and a right side with these crossover points here. On this one, this is the left side crossover. You want to put your tire lever up inside, like this direction of the arrow, right in the center between those 2 crossover points. And you have the spade, basically you're hooking the spade end up underneath there. Don't try to pry all 7 or 8 inches or whatever is left over on one prying attempt. That is definitely going to either break your tire lever, cause you some knuckle pain of some sort, or cause a pinch flat. Instead, what you do is once you've inserted your tire lever up in there, you slide it over close to this crossover point, maybe an inch or two away, and you're just prying this part over. And you'll get another 2 inches or so pried over. If you hear a little psh, guess what? You probably punctured your tube. If you don't hear that, you're probably good to go. Once you get that another inch or two on, you can try the method that I showed you before, pulling back on the tire lever towards you while pulling back on the tire. If that doesn't work again, try prying a little bit more of the tire over the rim. But this is really your last resort, and it is a possibility to puncture your tube if you do it this way. I have successfully pried tires over. I've also had episodes with really impossible tires where I just kept puncturing the tube. Usually if I'm the owner of a tire that's impossible, I go with different tires, just because I don't want to be doing this in a cold winter night outdoors with a tire that's just absolutely impossible to get on. That's just a recipe for frustration. Okay, so we have our tire installed back on the wheel, and let's put that wheel back on. So you remember I said put that chain on the smallest cog at the beginning, and when you go to put that back wheel back on, you want to guide the wheel in, and your top half of the chain, the part that's going towards the crankset on the top, is going to be guided onto the top part of this smallest cog. And as you guide the wheel into the frame, you might have to pull back or push down on this derailleur cage to get the chain to kind of wrap around the cog so that you can drop the wheel axle into this part of the frame. Believe it or not, this part of the frame is called the dropouts on both the frame and the front fork, because that's where the wheel drops out of, I guess. And you want your quick release or your axle nuts and any washers loose enough so that the wheel can just go into these dropouts pretty easily. Sometimes, especially with these caliper brakes, you know, the tire might be bumping into the brake pad. So you have to guide the wheel in between the brakes. If you have disc brakes, you have to make sure that the disc rotor is guided in between the pads of the disc brake caliper. And it's a pretty narrow space. You want to do that carefully so you don't accidentally dislodge the brake pads on the disc brakes. They're kind of in there loose. They're not bolted on real tight like rim pads are. The nice thing about disc brakes, you don't need to do anything like use the release levers, because the rotor on the disc brake just slides in and out of the caliper pretty easily. There is a little bit of a gap in there. So you want to guide the hub and the hub axle into the dropouts. And usually it just pops right in there. And you want to make sure that before you tighten any axle nuts or tighten the quick release lever, that the wheel is centered in the frame or the fork. Having the bike upside down vertically can help with this, or if you're doing it with the wheels down, you need to make sure that the bike is vertical, because if it sort of leans off to one side, then maybe the axle isn't sitting in there straight, which you'll notice right away as you go to ride, because something's going to be rubbing on the brakes. So if you have a quick release lever, please close the lever. If you loosened the quick release nut on the opposite side, you may have to retighten it. The quick release is not the same type of mechanism as a bolt-on hub. You don't leave that lever open and just tighten the nut on the other side as tight as you can. Your hub is still relatively loose inside the frame or the fork, and it can fall out, which is a very bad crash. So the way to know if your quick release is tight is when you go to close it. Here it's open. When I close it, I should start getting resistance halfway closed. If I go 3/4 of the way before it starts getting resistance, it's not going to be tight enough. So you might want to tighten the nut on that other side, half a turn, a full turn, until you're getting resistance halfway closed. Then you close it all the way. When it's closed all the way and you can see the word closed or close, try rotating it in the closed position. Even with a little strength, if it can rotate, you need to tighten that lever. So open it up again. This time, maybe just tighten the nut on the other side, a 1/4 turn or a 1/2 turn, close it again, check it and make sure you can't rotate it in the closed position. With bolt-on hubs, you can just finger tighten them, then use your wrench to tighten them pretty snug. I wouldn't overdo it. You don't want to strip the threads out of the axle or the axle nuts, but do use some strength to get them pretty snug. And then once I have it all installed, I pump up the tire to its rated pressure. As you are doing that, especially with fatter tires, you want to make sure the tire is seated evenly all the way around. If you get a spot that is where the bead is kind of loose to the rim or it's exposed a little bit, what will happen is you put pressure in there is the tube is saying, oh, a weak spot. I'm going to push this tire off the rim at this spot, and then you'll hear a loud bang. Oftentimes you'll see it starting to come off, and if you act quickly and let air out of the tube at the valve, you'll be able to prevent your tube from exploding. I forgot to mention something with the Presta valves, the little skinny valves. To put air in, of course you have to take the little cap off, but the Presta valves have you have to unscrew the top of it. It's not spring loaded like the Schrader valve. So you unscrew the top of that. It won't come out. You just unscrew it until it's loose. Then you put your pump on. Otherwise, you're not getting air in there because the valve is screwed closed. And then after you've got the wheel securely inside the frame and you've pumped up the tire, please remember to reconnect your brakes. Just put the quick release lever down for these types of brakes. Don't need to do anything with disc brakes. If it's a V brake, you need to guide the cable in between the slot that's in this little arm right here. Make sure this little curved noodle is kind of sticking out a little bit, and then you slide this rubber boot, this seal against the end of that noodle so that it's just kind of a dirt seal. And then test the brakes. Make sure they're not rubbing on the rim. Maybe they got bumped or knocked while you were installing the tire. Make sure that they engage the wheel evenly. Make sure that they're not rubbing on one side and that they bounce back evenly after you release the brakes. Just give them a quick test. You can also lift up the wheel that you were working on, give it a forward spin, and see if anything is rubbing. And that is it. You were done. You successfully fixed your flat tire, and now you're on the road and everybody's happy. So that is the end of our slide deck. I do see looks like two questions or comments in the chat. I am going to allow you to unmute yourself. So if you have questions or comments, you can ask them verbally, but you have to unmute yourself first. So let's go to our chat and see what we've got here. We already talked about e-bikes. Okay, Caroline asks, how do I shift the chain onto the smallest cog? So you got to use your shifter for that. I would assume you know how to use the shifter on your bike. If you don't, we have a class for you called Bicycling Basics, Bike Skills 201, if you don't know how to use your shifter. But it does involve using your shifter so that it releases the cable all the way out so that the back derailleur would bounce all the way to the right, which is where that smallest cog is. And then what you're going to have to do is probably lift the back wheel off the ground and pedal the crank a turn or two so that the chain actually moves to that smallest cog. Or just, if you have a flat, do your last bit of riding, just shift it to the smallest cog with your shifter. You can't really do it by hand if the derailleur is left in whatever gear that it's already in. The chain just isn't going to move down there. And we have a Craigslist ad for a Lotus Challenger bike, which hopefully does not need flat tires replaced, but Lotuses were pretty nice Japanese-made lug steel bikes. If anybody's interested, please privately message Mr. Landau. All right, Dan is asking about tubeless, and I'm going to come back to that question because it's somewhat off topic. Gary is asking, do we sell compact mini books with slides showing these steps? No, but that's a great idea. Maybe we should. You will get this slide deck. I'm sorry, you will get the slide deck. You'll get this entire class, this recording with the slide deck in part of a follow-up email. There are lots of bike repair books out there. You can get them at Amazon or Barnes & Noble. Bicycling Magazine has published one that is where I learned a lot of stuff. Park Tool has a very good one that's written for the amateur mechanic, lay person. John, I don't have pretzels, but your second question, I could teach a class on anything right now, how to change diapers on a baby. And somebody would ask, when will bike shops resupply with bikes? And unfortunately, from what I'm hearing, I have some contacts and friends at Jamis, which is a local company. The situation's not good. Supply is still disrupted. It's just a hot mess that relates to the bike industry itself, but also shipping and transportation is a problem. Shipping containers, availability of ships. They're saying, what I'm hearing is that they're having problems getting parts. It's not just whoever's knocking the frames together, it's getting the parts from the manufacturers who make the parts that go on your bikes. So I would say, if you know of a model of bike that you want, work with your local bike shop to get that model ordered for you. And what I'm hearing is that the warehouses are empty. Bikes get shipped in and they're already pre-ordered by the shops or the customers, and they go right back out. I was told last fall that this situation would have improved by this time of year, but that's not what I'm hearing now. And yeah, it's a mess. Okay. The other way to go, and we do have a bike buyer's guide class that we offer about once a month, is to buy a good quality used bike off of eBay or Craigslist. I wouldn't go on Amazon and buy a piece of junk bike. Yeah, John, it was last year, I said probably, or it was Trek was telling me on one of our classes that they would be in good shape by spring. But I haven't talked to Trek, but I can say Jameis is saying they're not in good shape. And I can't imagine if a big company like Jameis is, that anybody else is going to be any different. Okay, so Najib is asking, what is your take on 100% solid tires? And that's a good question, because I grew up in an area of the United States that has this terrible invasive species called the puncture vine. And they're all over the place out on the Great Plains and further west. And I used to get flat tires like crazy as a kid, and I didn't know how to change them, and I couldn't ride my bike. And so I finally invested in a type of tube that was basically like a thick rubber hose, a thick rubber hoop that I was able to install inside my tires. So that solved my flat tire problem, because I didn't need to put air in that thing. The tube was so thick that it supported the weight of the bike and me on it. Now, what was the downside? The thing rode like a tractor with concrete tires, and it was heavy. Now we're talking like 1980s technology here. There are some solid tires out there. One of them's manufactured, and I can't remember the name of it. It'll come to me. It's an Indian company. And I've seen them at Taipei Cycle. We've experimented with them on some of our bikes, just because our bike fleet manager was getting tired of changing flats. The downside was the installation was very difficult. It used a series of little clips, maybe 2 or 3 dozen little tabs per tire to get them on, and then you had to pry the thing on there. And they come with their own special tool to kind of pry them over. It's like a much more glorified tire lever. He had such a difficult time getting them on that I was like, I don't think changing that flat tires is that big of a problem, and we can train our instructors how to do that. I would say they're made of very different materials. It's kind of a dense foam, so they probably ride better than the 1980s thick hose tube type thing that I installed in my tire. They're also pretty lightweight. They will wear out, and then somebody's going to have to know how to replace those things, how to get them off. And I'm not sure shops are really familiar with this technology. So let's go back to Dan's question, and we're going to have to wrap up here. Tubeless tires. So what is a tubeless tire? Well, there's this kind of old technology that's been around for a while that you could buy. You could buy a tube that was self-sealing and had something called slime, or one of its competitors, in it. And that slime is self-sealing. So if you ran over a thorn or a tack, the hole was small enough that the pressure inside the tire would start blowing slime through it, and it seals up. It dries up pretty quickly. I don't know how it doesn't dry up inside the tire, but it dries up pretty quickly and seals the tire. And now the downside of that was it did add a fair amount of weight. You have a tube and the slime. So then somebody figured out, well, if we have the slime, why do we need a tube? Like most vehicles out there on the road, cars, trucks, tractors, don't use tubes. the tires are installed pretty tightly on the rims. They put some kind of a sealing agent around the edge. They also use a bead. And then they use a heck of a lot of air pressure to inflate the tire and to get it to seat on the truck rim or the car rim. And it holds air without a tube. Like older cars, older trucks, older equipment use tubes. By and large, now they don't. So that same technology is kind of around for bike tires. There are some do-it-yourself YouTube videos out there. If you have, I think, a conventional rim and a conventional tire, I'm not sure you can use a conventional tire, bike tire for tubeless, but you might be able to get away with a conventional rim, and it involves a certain kind of duct tape or the sealing strips, and you have to have an air compressor. I mean, you're going to need to deliver a lot of air very quickly. You generally can't use a standard floor pump to install a tubeless tire. A lot of people who want to go with this technology have to have a bike shop set it up for them, because even with the right rim that's tubeless compatible, the correct tire that's tubeless compatible, you still have to have the valve stems, you have to have the sealant, you have to have the correct rim strips that are going to be airtight. And then to go install all that stuff, it's way, I would say, more tricky than what we just went through with installing a tube. You are dealing with a liquid here, the sealant. And so I think that's one of the cons. People who have ridden on tubeless systems swear by them. They say they're lighter, that they ride better. Fat bikes have really embraced tubeless because you can run very, very low air pressures. And if you do get a pinch flat, that tubeless system seals it up right away. As a mechanic, I've encountered tubeless tires at rest stops where, we're doing something and all of a sudden, it's like that spray confetti stuff that comes out of an aerosol can for parties. All of a sudden, that stuff is spraying out of the tire where there's a puncture, and that's what it's supposed to do. The cynical part of me, and I can be kind of a traditionalist when it comes to bike technology, even though I have some pretty modern bikes here, is that the bike industry is trying to sell stuff, and they like to sell new things, and they like to convince customers that it's new and better. I myself am sticking with tubes. I will say, as with tubes and even with puncture resistant tires, tubeless tires are not foolproof. I was riding home one night in the Bronx, and it was a very cold winter night. And there was a cyclist with a pretty nice bike stopped, and he was working on his tire. And I stopped to help him, and he had tubeless, which meant what I had with me was not going to help him. And I think he had gotten a very big cut or puncture in his tire. And tubeless won't seal that. Like if you get something big, you run over the edge of a steel can or something, or a knife blade, tubeless will solve little punctures. They won't solve big catastrophic failures. And I think that's what he had. So here it is, 20 degrees out, and all he has on his hands is a slimy mess, because that's kind of what that sealant is. It's very slimy. And that it was probably call a cab time for him at that point. With me, if it's that cold, I'm probably calling a cab anyway with regular tubes. But they can be, they can be hard to install. They do say they ride better and they're lighter. If you do have a catastrophic problem, you are pretty much out of luck with the tubeless. So I'm kind of sticking with tubes. I'm fine with what I've got. But if you want to try it, try it. Let's see, Gary asks, are the tires flat resistant and the tubes? So you can buy flat resistant tubes, and I tried this too in my younger days when I lived out in puncture vine country. I don't think puncture resistant tubes are very effective. They are effective at adding a lot of weight to your tire, but all it is a thicker layer of rubber, and something sharp's going to go through that anyway. If you want puncture resistance, go with the puncture resistant tire. Some of them are pretty darn bomb proof. Like I use the Continental Gator skins, and I hardly ever get flat tires. I bought another particular Continental a few years ago, and it didn't have any puncture resistant lining in it, and was in puncture vine country, and I got flat tires all over the place. It was driving me crazy. So if you don't want to go tubeless, your next best option is a puncture resistant tire, and there are some very, very good ones out there. And so that is it for chat questions. Does anybody have any verbal questions they want to ask out loud? The silence is deafening. Well, I want to thank everybody for coming. If you don't have any questions or comments, spending your evening with us. I hope that you don't get any flat tires, because it's never any fun. They always happen at the wrong dang time because there's never a right time. But that if you do get a flat tire, you know what to do about it, and that it turns out to be a relatively easy job for you. I don't mean to scare people with stories of tough, difficult tires. Most of the time, if you know what to do, it's a pretty easy job. It's when you don't know what to do that's very difficult. So good luck, happy riding, and may your riding days be flat free. Have a good evening, everybody.